Chers collègues, bonjour.
Good morning, colleagues. I'll be speaking my mother tongue.
Voilà, je me souviens toujours quand avec Monsieur
I'll always remember that Mr. Frattini and I really fought to ensure that Italian was one of the 5 main languages or default languages for documents, etc. So I'll be continuing in Italian. So, first of all, I'd like to wish you all a good morning. Microphone lost for the President, unfortunately.
La mia presidenza dell'osservatorio per lo sviluppo. C'est OK maintenant?
Can you all hear me now?
Allora, ripeto, è l'ultima.
As I was saying, this today is the last meeting that I will be chairing unless there's an emergency of the Sustainable Development Observatory of the European Economic and Social Committee, which falls under the NAT committee activities. And this is something that I've drawn a lot of satisfaction from. And so let me tell you what the languages are for today. One can speak and listen to French, German, English, Italian, and Spanish. We have scheduled an end to this meeting around 1 o'clock, so we won't have any technical issues or problems with the interpreters' working hours, and I'd like to in advance thank the interpreters for their work. This brings me to the substance of today's meeting. A public meeting of reflection on big topics related to trade and sustainability, how these two link up, reciprocity within food chains, etc. What I think we should do on the occasion of this public meeting is to try and give meaning to everything that we've been trying to do in the past 2.5 years. As usual, we deal with very sensitive issues which involve European policy, both internally and on the international scene. We all know that things are very sensitive right now. It's a delicate time for all the countries that make up the European Union and for the entire world as well. However, today we need to look at agriculture and agri-food systems, and our aim is to ensure that there is ever more sustainability and equity, social, environmental, and also economic equity in all of the approaches that we take. In the context of the Green Pact, EU policies are obviously coming under a lot of pressure due to many complications, which on the one hand lead to despair and on the other to hope. Now, when we talk about sustainable agri-food systems, we have to also look at matters which are, strictly speaking, related to international trade and the EU policies in that regard. I think that international trade and the political activities of the European Union really can be a strategic instrument of great importance for us. Trade and international trade agreements are not simply an economic and social instrument. They've actually become a way of driving transformation, environmental transformation, but also economic, and it can change the way in which companies perceive their income. That's why we have to look at the sustainable development goals, and that's why reciprocity is so important. Now, I'm not talking about trade tariffs, which come up a lot at the moment, but really we're talking about how food is produced, how do we ensure that rules are enforced, how do we ensure that the relationship between workers and employers are respected, and that these rules for protecting human rights are first and foremost upheld. And of course, health comes into the mix as well. Trade policy can be a tool to help the transition towards sustainability. What I've said from the very first meeting is you, colleagues, as my witness in the room and online, that we need to do this in a very realistic manner. We cannot remain at the ideological level. We have various institutions represented here today. Thank you very much for your presence. But beyond institutions, civil society has a very important role to play. And here we find ourselves having to look at very important issues, such as the Commission's recent vision for agriculture, the thinking that's currently underway on the post-2027 CAP, as well as the expectations that have arisen from the UN Summit on agri-food systems. So we've decided to tackle these topics, and we've asked important experts from the institutions to join us for this discussion. We have with us today some colleagues who have a significant contribution to make to help us all find some answers, to provide us with some suggestions, some observations, some food for thought. Which is something we all need to keep in mind. Flavio Coturni, for example, a colleague and friend, head of unit from DG Trade. Also Agatha from DG Agri. She's also in charge of very sensitive issues, delicate issues. I think the ACP agreements, if I'm not mistaken. So we've got a number of people we can speak to. Then we have a video of Carmen Crespo Diaz, who is the EP rapporteur on the future of agriculture and the post-2027 Common Agricultural Policy. Without any further ado, I'd like to hand over to Flavio. You have 8 minutes, Flavio, to present to us what you think is most important. Thank you.
Thank you, President, and thank you to the Sustainable Development Observatory, to you all for this invitation. 8 minutes to describe the relationship between trade and sustainability, it's quite a challenge. So I'll try to be as brief as possible, focusing only on the main themes. Agatha will definitely complement the points, and I think, and then we will also open, I guess, the discussion for questions and answers, which is always the most interesting part and the most dynamic and interesting part of the debate. The relationship between trade and sustainability is a relationship which has been going on for decades now. It's a relationship which plays out at different levels, multilateral, through standard setting body where the Commission is clearly involved in negotiating certain standards internationally, but this takes long and it's a long-term endeavor. Unilaterally and by different means, and we have different examples recently of how unilaterally the EU has been setting requirements and conditions for imports. I would mention deforestation, due diligence, the two due diligence directives, the one on reporting and the one on due diligence, and several ad hoc initiatives also in the agri-food sector on neonicotinoids, animal welfare, etc. I would focus on the bilateral side because this is the one which establishes a more direct link and relation with the so-called trade negotiations we have in FTA. And as you know, these agreements, they offer an opportunity to make trade greener, fairer and more sustainable. In these trade agreements, we have 14 trade agreements with dedicated TSD chapters covering 21 countries. The latest which entered into force was the interim agreement with Chile on February this year. We have in these agreements TSD commitments and enforcement which have been clearly essential to ensure the ratification of these agreements. Now, in June 2022, we had also a TSD review, which has envisaged further technical and political commitments on top of what we had. It's important to highlight that these trade agreements between the EU and its trade partners, they aim at ensuring the effective implementation of international labour conventions and environmental agreements, which include the respect of core principles of the International Labour Organization, ILO, and also the effective implementation of the Paris Agreement and climate change. But they do not only foresee these type of commitments, they also protect the regulatory space, reserving the right to be more ambitious. They foresee the effectively enforcement of the environmental and labour laws, and also they prioritize the liberalisation of goods and services, in particular on sustainable, precisely goods and services. Now, I mentioned the TSD review of 2022. The participation and support of the civil society within the implementation of and enforcement of these agreements has been enhanced, in particular by providing an easier way of access to the TSD complaint mechanism. So civil society has an easier access to the complaint mechanism, by allowing, for example, civil society representatives to lodge a complaint in case of violation of sustainability commitments to the single entry point, which is within DG Trade, which allows to start a procedure, kick off a procedure, to see eventually what type of measures have to be adopted in order to correct this violation. The review of 2022 also included, as a last resort, the suspension of preferences for material breaches of the Paris Agreement and ILO fundamental labour principles. The FTA with New Zealand is the first to include all the features of the reviewed TSD policy. I would also mention that very important in the context of our agreements with our partners are the domestic advisory groups. I mention these because this is particularly important in this institution. These advisory groups in the EU and also in the partner countries, they bring together labor and business organizations to discuss and advise on the implementation of the sustainability angles of the trade agreements, but also on the trade agreements more in general. The external relations section of your institution, EEC, is the secretariat of the EU domestic advisory groups, and you know that these groups meet regularly over the year, and in particular they have a joint meeting ahead of the civil society group together with a third country, and they are extremely important in terms of cooperating, advising the institutions, and also detecting possible problems in terms of implementation of sustainability. So this is just briefly the reference to how trade and trade agreements, in particular sustainability, work. This relationship between trade and sustainability is a complex one, as you know. It's one which also reflects the complex relationship between trade policy, between sustainability and food security. And you know that this relationship and balance between food security and sustainability has changed over time. In the last 5 years, we have seen how the priorities have shifted. This will inevitably have also an effect on the relationship between the trade policy and sustainability in general. I'd like also to make one general point about this relationship between trade and sustainability. We should give this relationship and the positive effects of trade on sustainability its right determination and consideration. This means we should not overestimate the effect of trade policy on sustainability. Trade policy is one of the means, along other policies, to provide positive effects on sustainability, but it's not the only policy, and it's not, I would say, even the most important one. I'm saying this because sometimes we forget that in the weight of trade, for example, in terms of exports of third countries towards the EU market, are just a minor share of the a minor percentage or share of the exports of these partners vis-à-vis the rest of the world. So third countries will not easily change their production methods and requirements just because the EU market represents only a tiny share of the overall exports to the world. So in some cases it is possible, in some other cases we don't have the weight and the leverage to be possibly convincing and persuading third countries to change their production patterns and methods. Another point which I'd like to make, and which will no doubt come back when we have the discussion and the Q&A, is the contribution of trade policy to the so-called level playing field. Here we enter into the competitiveness angle. It should be reminded that indeed the compliance costs are indeed important, but they do not represent the highest cost for farmers and producers in third countries. Labor, land, feed costs, they represent much more in terms of final price and in terms of final costs, which brings us precisely to have a correct evaluation of what compliance costs mean. This is because often we hear that sustainability requirements are essential for the level playing field. We forget that there are other costs which are much more important in terms of competitiveness for EU agriculture. And last point, we need also to remind that tariffs are extremely important. Usually, when in this debate about the level playing field in agriculture, agriculture is treated as an exception vis-à-vis other sectors. We do not necessarily liberalize agricultural products. We rather have a protectionist approach in our trade agreements, whereby we treat agriculture as an exception by means of sensitive products, by means of volumes, and we do not liberalize this sector. This is important because in the debate about level playing field, the treatment of sensitive products, so the exception vis-à-vis the full liberalization of trade is much more important than any other consideration when we look at the competitive and preserving the sustainability, the economic sustainability of the sector. I would stop here and thank you.
Thanks, Flavio, grazie. Adesso Agata.
Now may I hand over to Agatha.
Prego.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for the invitation. So indeed, as rightly the President mentioned in the introduction, you mentioned the vision. Obviously, that's something I'd like to start with on my intervention. The vision for agriculture and food, so the communication that the Commission adopted earlier in February this year. And the vision, in fact, is very much about emphasizing close engagement with institutions, with farmers, with civil society, with various food chain operators. And it's in that context that I find today's discussion very, very timely and interesting. So the vision is a roadmap. It's an ambitious roadmap built on the principles of sustainability, resilience, and fairness. It's good to remember that it is part of an overall agenda of the EU on security, competitiveness, and sustainability, which in turn is committed to supporting the international rules-based order, as well as the Agenda 2030, with the goal of reaching sustainable development goals. So that's the framework in which the vision should be seen. An important thing to say is that the vision recognizes in a very clear way that farming and food are a strategic sector for Europe's economy, security and autonomy. And I always repeat that. I find this a very important statement to make, which provides us the context in which agricultural policy as well is operating. So the roadmap is about providing an attractive and competitive agri-food system for current, but obviously also for future generations. And the initiatives in the vision are, let's say, organized across 4 priority areas. The first one is building an attractive sector which ensures a fair standard of living and leverages new income opportunities for farmers. The second one is a competitive and resilient sector in the face of global challenges. The third one, a future-proof sector which works hand in hand with nature. And the last sector which values food and offers fair living and working conditions in vibrant rural areas. And then each of these priority areas contains specific policy responses which are aimed at addressing the 3 elements of sustainability: economic, environmental, and social. Now, the issue of reciprocity of standards, so the core of the topic you're addressing today, is of course fundamental for our farmers. And I think they have also made their voice heard clearly. But it is also fundamental for a transition towards fair and sustainable food systems, and be that for the EU or at the global level. Let me switch. So I think the question is precisely bringing in the trade policy into this dimension. The question is how best for us, policymakers, to foster a competitive and resilient agri-food sector, because that is what we want, but within within a global trade system, which, as we know, is under substantial pressure from, I'll just mention a few elements: climate change, global competition, uncertain geopolitics, as well as higher input prices. For the Commission, and that's what has been laid out in the vision, it is important to assure a fair global level playing field for our farmers. It is equally important to find a policy response which allows us to avoid social and environmental leakages, which could lead to relocation of production to countries with lower environmental standards. As the vision presented in February, our approach to these aspects would consist of actions organized around two topics. The first one I'll mention is global and bilateral cooperation. And here the Commission will continue working with partners and international organizations with the goal of raising standards globally and moving globally towards sustainable food systems. And here, of course, cooperation is a key word. Cooperation with our trading partners as well as with multilateral organizations. And then we have the bilateral level, and that's what Flavio has just been talking about in his intervention. Indeed, the EU can use bilateral trade negotiations and agreements to their full extent as a tool to raise standards on sustainability. The second element of the action is what we do here at home. That is setting a framework within the Union for a competitive agri-food sector. And here there are a few elements that I'd like to bring into the discussion. Let me first recall what remains a reference point for us in the Commission when we talk about reciprocity of standards. So you will all remember very well the report which the Commission prepared in June 2022, the report on the application of EU health and environmental standards to imported agri-food products. So that remains the reference for us today. You will remember that the report confirmed that it is possible to apply production standards to imports, obviously under certain strict conditions which are clearly defined by WTO rules, so that these measures must be necessary to address the environmental and climate objectives, if we're talking about environment, which are in any case objectives to which the EU has committed as part of international agreements. The measures must be transparent, non-discriminative, based on science, and the report also underlines special emphasis on international cooperation, as well as capacity building and support to the most vulnerable countries. And indeed, so Flavio made reference to a few instances where the EU has already taken steps towards reciprocity for imported products in relation to production methods, indeed deforestation regulations or the lowering of the MRLs for the two neonicotinoids are one of the examples. Now, if I can come back to the vision. So the vision announces that the Commission will work towards deepening reciprocity. And that is with a view of ensuring that apart from advancing on the need for a global for a high level of global standards, there is also a need to ensure that our own agri-food sector is not put at a competitive disadvantage without a corresponding reciprocity. So in this context, the Commission intends to pursue a stronger alignment of production standards applied to imported products, and notably in the area of pesticides and animal welfare. You will know that the vision mentions a principle that the most hazardous pesticides banned in the EU for health and environmental reasons would not be allowed back to the EU through imported products. Now, the way that the Commission proposes to advance on this is to launch an impact assessment, and we have taken a commitment to do that this year. And the impact assessment will precisely consider the impacts on the EU's competitive position, as well as international implications of this principle. In the area of animal welfare, the vision also commits to ensuring that future legislative proposals would apply the same standards for products produced in the EU and those imported from foreign countries. And here you know obviously that there is already EU animal welfare legislation which is applicable to imports as well, and I'm thinking of the transport, protection of animals during transport. Okay, coming to the CEP now. So, of course, Common Agricultural Policy, a very important instrument, especially for us. I'm from DG Agri, and indeed an instrument which is currently about to be reformed again. So, yes, there is work in the Commission on the legislative proposals for the next CAP reform, which, as you know, will come out in the next few months. So the Common Agricultural Policy in the context of this sustainability discussion will continue to accompany farmers in the transition towards sustainable food systems, and what we hope through a better targeted and simpler system of support. It is important to say that CAP already rewards farmers who are engaged towards sustainable practices, and that obviously has to remain the case for the future policy as well. So in the EU, if we look at the topic of sustainable agriculture, there's quite a mix of policy tools which are being used, which include regulation, requirements, subsidies, but also research, innovation, training. The Commission will, on the basis of the roadmap which we have, which comes from the vision, we will obviously engage with other institutions as well as with third country partners and international organizations on the international side of this work. And here I'd like to make three points to note three elements. So one of the goals will be improved implementation of commitments and agreements, as well as increasing the global ambition for sustainable food systems. The second point would be raising global standards in international setting bodies. And then the third point that we would focus on is the development of a common approach to the assessment of sustainability standards, which we see as complementing our own work on the benchmarking of sustainability, which, you know, is quite an important task that is undertaken in DG Agri. Now, another important element of the discussion on sustainability is food security, and I think it's worth to make a point on that as well. Sustainable agriculture in the three dimensions, the economic, the social and the environmental one, is essential to achieve global food security. And that also should be kept in mind. Obviously, countries have different approaches to sustainability. So far, in the various international organizations, we have not managed to find a common definition of sustainability. But the challenges that we are facing are the same, which is why the approaches to these challenges should have a common ground. Climate change, environmental degradation are a threat to agriculture everywhere in the world, not just here in the EU. And of course, that's also a thing to say that vulnerable developing countries are often the ones who end up the most affected. It is therefore in this context that I find it important to say that agriculture and food systems, of course, do have a responsibility for the current state of the food systems, but they are also part of the solution. And let me just highlight in this context that it is important how actively the EU participates in the UN food systems process. And I saw that you have a next session with Leonard Mitzi, so I'm sure that you will be discussing this in more detail, but also in the context of processes within the G20. So this year it's under South Africa's presidency. And there is also quite concrete work ongoing in the OECD and in the WTO, which touches upon sustainability of agriculture. I'll stop there. I'll be happy to engage in a discussion later. Thank you.
Grazie mille, Agatha.
Thank you very much, Agatha, for that really comprehensive report that you have given us. I think now, Luca, we have to send out that video of Carmen Crespo-Diaz, who is the EPP rapporteur on the future of the Common Agricultural Policy.
The CAP is important for all countries in the European Union and under the European Commission. So dealing with this topic with the EESC is one of the most important topics that the Commission, the Council and the Parliament are dealing with. At the moment, we're working on what the CAP can be post-2027. But what does this mean? At this point in time, there's an appetite for change. But what do we want to change? More simplification so that farmers can have a better CAP that is better equipped, while also allowing them to be more competitive, to get the youth on board, to include technology in the agricultural sector, which is feeding the entire continent. What is important at this point in time, that important defense that the EU has is, without any doubt, food. Food sovereignty is very important, and to a large extent it depends on what support the CP provides to farmers. This income aid that the first pillar is supposed to provide and the second pillar as well has to deal with technology, innovation and the possibility for one of these key EU policy areas to feed into the goal of food sovereignty and also to help our farmers, men and women, herders. But what do we want to change? It's not a radical change within the CAP. It's a very specific, targeted, interested change that will help farmers who are the most vulnerable, but will also help professionals, irrespective of their size, that they can continue to remain competitiveness. And at the moment, we've dealt with other issues. We've had other regulation that has actually been counter to farmers' interests. Now, we have to talk about budget as well. I do understand that at the moment the EU is looking at its capacity to feed into defense and security for all Europeans. But what is clear is that one weapon of defense, as I said, is food sovereignty. And so we have to ensure that our farmers can continue to produce food. And what do they need for this? They need equal opportunities. And within equal opportunities, we have to talk about agreements with other countries outside of the European Union, but they have to be reciprocal agreements that ensure the same conditions for our EU farmers as well. We also have to provide our farmers with guarantees that they have the necessary tools to balance the agriculture sector, as also to continue providing food. For example, a lack of water is a major problem. If Europe is dry, we're not going to be able to continue to produce. We also have to provide economic support for the same. Of course, our budget is not unlimited, but we do have the possibility to beef up the CAP in the first and second pillar and use funds from things like the European Investment Bank. We have the PESH committee, which is also looking at supporting young farmers and young fishers. And we also have to talk about improving our water resources, improving our environmental conditions, fighting climate change, and feeding into sustainable development. Fighting climate change is not just about imposing difficulties on farmers. Fighting climate change is to create equal opportunities for them to enter the circular economy. And in order to do this, we have to invest in the circular economy. Herders at the moment are losing 20% of their herds, and this is a major issue for rural areas. The circular economy, for example, can lead to opportunities through the production of biogas. It can give them opportunities to really get their resources back into the economy. And so basically what we're talking about is creating new opportunities. We have a new commission that is banking on competitiveness, and it's looking at creating a CAP in 2027 that creates opportunities and possibilities. So what we're hoping for here with the CAP is a good budget that can help us to face all the challenges that our farmers in the EU are dealing with. Let's not forget, each country is different. They have a different way of dealing with farming and herding, but all of them united and in a complementary fashion can achieve success. We can't leave agriculture to its own devices. We have up to 70% that is going outside of the EU, and in a way we are depriving agriculture and herding in Europe with opportunities. Agriculture is also a sector for innovation, for youth employment, and it's also a way to keep people in rural areas. This is very important within the CAP, and we can't forget about this. Furthermore, having a WTO that is modernized and that can change, that can actually place agriculture at the heart of policy, that is something that can help us to fight unfair trade practices and help us to protect the value chain for farmers. I think this is work that will help us to reach a stronger sector, and in a way will also be able to promote European products. We have amazing products, PDIs, PGOs here in Europe. We have systems as well that actually strengthen rural areas. We have cooperatives, for example, as well as SMEs in rural areas in Andalusia, for example. We cannot set out hurdles. We are all united. The commissioner, the parliament, the council, and the commission as a whole are united to creating an amazing CAP. The only thing that's missing is the MFF that we hope will ensure sufficient capacity and budget to create a CAP for all. Thank you.
Grazie.
Thank you. Thank you to MEP Carmen Crespo-Diaz for that report. If the Secretary could please extend our thanks to her, that would be very, very good. We have now 10 minutes before us, dear colleagues, that we can spend on a discussion, a debate We can take advantage of the fact that we have 2 Commission representatives with us here to answer questions to the extent possible, of course, given the situation. Who would like to start?
De Coster, prego, un vero agricoltore.
A true farmer.
Oui, voilà. Merci pour les exposés.
Thank you very much for the presentations. The first thing I'd say is that trade, in a way, is buying peace. I mean, already if we have exchanges, we're not going to engage in conflicts with people we trade with. We export 80 billion euros worth of agricultural products, so the balance is quite good. But I think we have to underline the degree of complexity here as well. When we're talking about CO2 and emissions reductions, I think that we have some issues there that we have to try and solve. But sometimes people don't care about this. If at one end labor costs 5 euros and somewhere else it costs 45 euros, at, for example, here in Europe, then nobody cares about CO2. Importing is much cheaper. Also, when we're talking about agricultural imports, for example, imports cannot have hormones, okay, but is it that they don't contain hormones or that hormones were not used? Because I think in Belgium, we all know, for example, we can check for certain things, but in many cases, you just have a rubber stamp that said everything's okay and you somehow believe that. Now, when we're talking about chicken, for example, I mean, you have countries that are leaders in chicken production, and are we going to continue to import from them? Or are we going to support production at home here in Belgium or in Europe? I mean, do we want to then try and import, for example, Ukraine, who will soon be part of the European Union? So I think that there are so many issues to discuss, and of course, it's a very complex domain. Thank you.
Encore une question, José Puceu.
Jose Puceu, another question there.
Gracias.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Chair. And thank you to our speakers. Thank you for structuring this debate, setting the scene, and to follow up from what we did at the last meeting of the SDO. Now, what we talked about this morning, I think everything we're discussing are key elements for the future. MEP Crespo gave us a state of play regarding the immediate context when we're talking about the CAP reform and the MFF negotiations. It's something that's going to kick off in July. I think it's going to be a very important event that's going to set the tone for the future. Now, we've said that we need a strong CAP. We need a CAP that has enough budget at its disposal. But let's not forget that we need to look at the needs of the entire agri-food chain in Europe. We are in the offensive when it comes to a number of products. We can continue to maintain a very strong presence at local, regional, and international level. But what we need is for the Commission, especially the Council, to act in a very coherent form. For example, when we're talking about duties and tariffs, at the moment, many discussions underway at the moment, and this is being discussed with the US administration. So we can't just talk about compensatory mechanisms. Yesterday, we had a meeting where we talked about the full package. But for us, for farmers, for companies, we want to remain present in these markets. We want to grow our presence in these markets. So what we're asking for is an offensive position, not a defensive position. Because the gap that we will leave in the market will be filled by our competitors from third countries. So it's very important to remember this as we shape the future. Another important point here is linked to my previous point, and that is clarity. DG Trade has all our information, all our opinions, and they've always taken them on board. It's very important to have clarity when we're talking about implementing and engaging in multilateral negotiations. my colleague Mark da Costa said that the scenario has changed. For example, a change in a position when it comes to sanctions regarding Russia has left us out of the Russian market since the invasion of Crimea. It's not started when they invaded the Donbass or when they started sending Russian tanks to Kiev. It's in fact since the annexation of Crimea that we have lost our access to Russian markets. And this is an immense impact for our producers of citrus, stone fruit, etc. They lost access to a high value, high quality sector, a high volume sector as well. And of course, on one hand, we have political decisions that support sanctions against Russia. We do understand that. But on the other hand, this leads us to lose market share. But look at the reverse as well. When we're talking about tariffs on Russian products, and there was a Spanish member of the ESE, the largest importer of imports from Russia, or from Ukraine, in fact, Spain imports over 5 million euros worth, or 5 million tons rather, of food grains from Ukraine. And I think that this is something that's very important for pig farmers, because they actually consume sunflower seed cakes. And I mean, all of these decisions do end up having a side effect. So when we take a decision, we have to talk about the real impact and how it's going to affect agricultural economies and value chains. Another very important topic that's also on the table, and we've had some indications from the Parliament on this. I mean, I still don't believe this. For 20 years we've been talking about this. But let's see how this really happens. But they're saying they're going to conclude the EU-Mercosur negotiations. I mean, okay, great. But there are some topics on which we have offensive positions, and that could be useful. But there are also going to be some impacts that have to be alleviated. And those impacts can be much further reaching than what's in these agreements. So we have some very sensitive sectors, and they need this very essential reciprocity to ensure that these sectors do not disappear. So we need to keep in mind these sensitivities, and I hope that the Commission keeps in mind these demands coming from the different sectors, and that they're very important for the future. It's as important as ensuring that the CAP has enough budget. Thank you.
Voilà, simple. Un moment. C'est très bref maintenant.
Could you please keep it quite brief, because then I'd like to give our speakers the possibility to respond as well.
Thank you so much, Mr. President. Well, I will be very brief since the sanctions concerning Russia have been mentioned. I think that we should judge from the trade perspective the impact of the border regions, meaning the regions and the states which have a border with Ukraine. Because also from the social point of view, in those countries, and now I'm referring specifically to Romania and Poland, well, it was a factor which fueled the extreme right. And this is the first question. And the second question, after so many years of debating and discussing about applying or having an administration which is dealing with the entire supply chain, we still have enough data. We still are lacking fairness under common agriculture policy. And I will give you a concrete example. Still, we have different subventions among the member states. And we are discussing we are discussing about values which are part of the fundamental treaty concerning fairness, leaving no one behind and things like that. In the same time, and I will close with this, we are seeing that the farmer population is decreasing, but in Romania we do have 1 million farmers, subsistence farmers, which aren't receiving any subsidy. So we still have farmers, but we are not using our production capacity efficiently. Thank you so much.
Ok, thank you. Prego, la parola adesso.
We can now hand over to Agatha, perhaps.
Après Flavio.
Thank you very much for the comments. Well, it's an interesting debate, and I think it just shows the scope and the size of the challenges that we're dealing with and the various objectives that we're trying to meet with policy, be it agricultural policy or trade policy, which have to work together. So let me try to group your points as well and make references to MEP's Crespo online intervention. So maybe I could start with simplification. So also a topic about which I guess you hear and read a lot these days. It's just last week that the simplification package was adopted by the Commission. This is one of important considerations for the work that is undertaken on the next CAP reform. And I also noticed in the speech that President von der Leyen delivered yesterday in the annual EU budget conference, there is a reference to a simpler budget. So I think this gives us already an indication, an important indication of a clear direction, which goes certainly beyond just agricultural policy. I think that this is important to say in the context precisely of the challenges that you talk about. So many issues came up. Trade came up as one of the challenges. Geopolitics came up as a challenge. Distribution of support, prices for farmers. There is many challenges out there. And it is true that in this context, the common agricultural policy has to be made responsive to these challenges. And this is also why I think you see that division that was adopted earlier this year does indicate a few elements which show a different kind of thinking that we hadn't had at all in all the past years under the common agricultural policy. Let me mention the unity safety net. So you will probably want to know more details of what the unity safety net is about. I'm not able to share those details at this stage, but I think it is an important indication of how the vulnerability of the sector in the context of, be it, well, the current trade threats or the tariffs which we will have to deal with from the US administration, how these kind of actions can have a negative impact on the sector and how we see a need to prepare for that. The instrument would be the unity safety net, to be, of course, prepared through the course of the year, which would cover the market aspects and as well as the legal aspects. But this certainly indicates a very different and a lot more strategic view of the common agricultural policy within the set of other policies in the EU. Another point I'd like to make, which also links some of the comments that I heard, is a general need for coherence across EU policies. And I think it's an important issue because we do notice that, well, even the vision itself is a communication about the full future of agriculture and food. So the addition of the food in there is also an important element to pay attention to, while the actions which are proposed go across the entire spectrum of Commission policies. And that also indicates the way that we in the Commission will need to be working in the future. We will be working together, so it's not just one policy which will be addressing the various objectives. There's also an intention for this flexibility and simplification of the budget to help the coherence of the policies. So many of the aspects which are raised here can be addressed through various policies, common agricultural policy being one of them. And then maybe one point, because I think it's important, the MEP made reference to that, to the dependencies which exist on the import side in European agriculture. This is indeed something which we are aware of, and this is something which is also present there in the vision. There is an intention from the Commission to present a strategy to reduce the strategic dependencies, and of course I'm talking mainly about fertilizers, so an important input needed to produce, and feed for animal feed, obviously. It's very short, it's difficult to address all the points, but it's just a few elements of the debate. Thank you so much.
It's clear. Fab.
Yeah, thank you. Indeed, there are several questions and different topics, all very complex. I will look at my notes and start maybe from the questions raised by Mr. De Coster on labor costs. I mentioned in my presentation how labor is very much present in the TSD chapter, Trade and Sustainable Development chapter of the trade agreements. There is a number of conventions, ILO conventions, which have to be ratified by the partner if we want to be precisely partners of the FTA. Not only have to be ratified, but then there is a follow-up and monitoring of the implementation and enforcement. If there is a problem, there are ways to address this by means of raising, for example, in the necessary established platforms, these questions and violation and complaints, so that there is a clear, close monitoring of this. The question of safety, you mentioned hormones, but more in general, I would say food safety is something which is to be complied with, no matter how. So there are no negotiations, there are no compromises when it deals with compliance with food safety requirements in the EU, be it human safety, animal safety, or phytosanitary issues. This has to be very clear, because sometimes in the debate we hear that we are importing dangerous products for human health. This is not the case. We are applying exactly the same food safety requirement to the food which is produced in the EU and the food which is produced elsewhere. Even the pesticides have to undergo a process of risk assessment and have to have a positive assessment by the Food Safety Authority, and if the positive assessment is there, the substance is authorized. So there should be clear, no misunderstanding of that to avoid precisely that we run into difficulties into the implementation of these concepts. On the autonomy of production in the EU, definitely, as mentioned by Agatha, we are strongly dependent on feed, in particular soya and fertilizers. We will see what the strategy gives in terms of strategic autonomy, in terms of protein, for example. It's obvious, at least to me, that we will not give away imports of soya, even if we increase the production and the self-sufficiency rate, which is currently stands at beyond 90% of the soya that we using in the EU comes from imports. Here the question, to me at least, is rather how to diversify and ensure that the diversification of sources of supply is maintained. And in that sense, I would say we will need to look at Ukraine not only as a threat, but also as an opportunity. This is a concept which I think we need to also be familiar with, because I know that Ukraine, and here comes the question that was raised by the other speaker, about the impact of Ukraine's imports on the neighboring countries. Definitely the Commission has reacted to that. Measures have been taken in terms of putting brakes to these imports whenever there was a risk or a threat of perturbation of the markets, in particular in the neighboring case. There have been volumes which have been established. We will now be negotiating with Ukraine the future of the trade arrangements with this country. But I invite you all also to consider that Ukraine, if you look at it in terms of food security and self-sufficiency, is also a big opportunity, not only for food security in the EU, but also food security for the rest of the world. Then the question of duties from the US was raised. As you know, this is a difficult question. We definitely want you to keep your market shares in the US, as well as in Russia. You know the geopolitical context in which the Commission, the Member States are acting, and the efforts that the Commission is making trying to find a settlement of the dispute with the US. My commission is currently engaged in very close contacts with these US counterparts. We definitely hope that this window of opportunity of 90 days that we have for the suspension of the additional duties that the Trump administration announced will be used in order to find a settlement. And even if it means that ultimately we will end up with a rate of duty for our imports, we definitely hope that these will move away the threat of a trade war, which will ultimately be extremely negative for the economies of the entire world. The question of Mercosur, the impact, Agad has mentioned the unity safety net. You have seen certainly the proposal that the Commission presented, the Commissioner Hansen presented recently. There is the intention to use the crisis reserve in a more focused way than in the past by putting outside of the crisis reserve or the payments which would have to be targeted to the natural disasters and animal health problems and so on. This would leave more space within the crisis reserve for the type of problems that may arise from or market disturbances that may arise from geopolitical problems or trade problems. There is also the announcement by the President of this 1 billion euros of possible fund that has been announced in the context of Mercosur. We will see in the context of the MFF if this will be carried out. And then there are the usual tools of the CAP, which are traditionally spent in support of farmers, which also definitely help in a preventive way to face these difficulties. And final point about the reciprocity. You mentioned reciprocity is important. You all mentioned reciprocity is important. I think it is important. We should not forget that, as I said, on food safety, there is no compromise. We are applying the requirements to imports. On environmental consideration, on environmental issues, and as well as on ethical questions, could be animal welfare, it could be looked at on a case-by-case basis, so not across the board. And as a matter of fact, it has been done, for example, on the so-called neonicotinoids, two substances, thiamethox and clothianidin, which have been prohibited. So whenever possible, the Commission does it. Whenever possible means that a number of conditions have to be met. Now, we have to remind that if you look at that from the other side of the world, they accuse us of protectionism. They think that, for example, our pesticides policy is so strict that their exports are hampered into the EU. And this is also an issue that we have to bear in mind, because definitely we have one of the strictest policy in the world when dealing with the food safety, but not only, also when looking at the environmental considerations and animal welfare consideration for inputs. So whenever possible, for example, slaughtering for animals, this is a condition, a requirement which is currently in force. It is implemented, checked, controlled in third countries. We go there, we check if the slaughter is done according to the requirements of the EU. Can we do other things? Let's look at them. Because otherwise we run the risk of green imperialism. Others will look at us saying, you are applying arbitrary measures to our exports to you without no justification. So we have to avoid also that we run into these unjustified measures. Thank you.
Thank you, Flavio. Allora, colleghi.
Dear colleagues, well, I'll start off by thanking our colleagues here from the Commission, as well as Carmen Crespo-Diaz for their input. I'd also like to thank you for the questions that you've put forward. They were very important indeed. And now we can close this first panel discussion. I'd like to invite Isabel Caño Aguilar to come up to the top table, as she will be moderating the next panel discussion. Thank you. Isabel, and thank you very much to our speakers.
Bien, yo voy a hablar en español.
I'll be speaking Spanish today because we have interpretation available. As Mauricio said, we will be focusing on the civil society perspective now, covering all the issues that have already been raised this morning. We have representatives from civil society, but we'll also have a commission representative who will sum up what we've heard from his point of view, and that will allow us to continue our dialogue with the Commission as well. So let's get started with our second panel then. It's entitled Civil Society Perspectives Ensuring Fairness, Reciprocity and Sustainability in Trade. I think these are crucial concepts that we have to bear in mind whenever we meet other institutions, in this case the Commission. As we're slightly late, running slightly late, I don't want to deprive our speakers of any speaking time. I am delighted that we have a panel made up of 3 women, so I'd like to welcome all of you here today. I think this shows just how committed the SDO is to promoting the representation of women in our debates. We'll start with Arianna Giuliodori, who works on farmers' rights when developing food systems. She's the director of the Brussels office of Coldiretti. Perhaps we could hear from you for 8 to 9 minutes, and then we can have a discussion with the room as a whole. So please get started. I'll shut up now. I can see that our president is back in the room, but Arianna, you have the floor.
Grazie mille. Parlerò italiano.
Thank you very much. I'll be speaking in Italian today, given that the opportunity is available to me. So first of all, thank you very much for inviting me here today. And thank you to the Observatory for taking on board this really important topic, which is the relationship between reciprocity and sustainability in trade. And here I'd like to add the idea of food safety and sovereignty, because that's also part of the entire thought process. I represent Coldiretti today, which is Italy's largest farmers organization. It also represents agri-food businesses. And what's really important to me is to tell you that our point of view is built with and shared with the farmers in many other countries, both in Europe and the rest of the world. The G20 has been mentioned. We worked a lot with our our farmer colleagues, in the G7. We're part of the global community of farmers in the north and in the south. Everyone shares many of the topics that I will be mentioning today. After the COVID pandemic, and given the current geopolitical context, it's very difficult to expect to deal with the topics that we are dealing with in the same spirit. Today, when we talk about sustainability and international trade, it is very different to a discussion you could have had on these topics 10 years ago. And that's why the SDO has really picked its timing very well. At an EU level, what we need is a strategic vision, which is more focused on farmers and the potential of farms to take forward a model of values, first and foremost, and of course the economic value that the EU would like to promote across the world. If I may extend, European farmers have always been multifaceted. They've always been committed to the fight against global warming and climate change, and they have understood the choices that consumers have made about high quality and high standards. And this is something that we're very proud about. We're proud of animal welfare, the protection of soils, issues related to labor and legality, etc. Farmers are not a problem that needs to be managed, as the previous Commission felt. Proof of that is the infamous Green Deal. I don't want to lose too much time in my introductory remarks, but I do want to say that what we've seen is a step change. New languages being used. And we really do appreciate what we're seeing now coming from Commissioner Hans's office. The content of that vision is really important, as Agata Gilinska was saying in the previous panel discussion. Now, farmers are being seen as a true stakeholder. But I'd like to, in a minute, get into the difference between what is being said and what is being done, and what is being prepared when we talk about stock taking. But I'll get back to that in a moment. I'd like to turn to international trade for a minute. More than 235 billion euros in exports can be seen in our agri and agricultural sector. Italy, the country that I represent, has exported almost 70 billion euros worth of agricultural products on the basis of a model which really promotes territorial differences and development, as well as high quality products. So biodiversity and environmental and social sustainability really has become our flagship. This is only possible and sustainable if the rules of the game are fair. Not equal for all, but fair at least. And unfortunately, that is not the case currently. So we find ourselves proudly defending high standards. At the same time, on the internal market, we find products that don't respect those same high quality standards. Remember the active substances and molecules that are banned in Europe but are allowed in countries from which we import. Let's think about workers' rights. Mr. Da Costa quite rightly broached this topic, or the fact that many products are cheaper once they arrive in the EU, as Mr. Pacheco was saying, because they are subject to less strict rules in the production chain that brings them to us. This is not only detrimental to European farmers, but it also jeopardizes the credibility of the EU and its policies. So what we want when it comes to reciprocity is that this is included in every agreement that we enter into, of course, but that it's also enforced. And we would like to tell you how we think it can be done. The first and most important point is to ensure that consumers are involved. We need to improve transparency on the market. We really do think that the origin on labels is very important. It's an important topic. It is fundamentally important if we do want true reciprocity. If a product that I have is lost in a market, if it's difficult to see where the products next to mine come from, it's very difficult for a consumer to make a fully informed decision and choose the European agricultural model. That's the first point. Transparency and labels. Secondly, of course, we need these reciprocity clauses in trade agreements so that the highest standards that we apply here are not a competitive disadvantage to us. I mean, we heard from DG Agri and DG Trade. It was quite useful to have those two DGs talking to us at the same time, because the Commissioner Hans has made a commitment, and DG Trade, Sante, Agri are trying to work on a solution to implement this commitment. We're quite curious to see what that will be. Third aspect is the controls. We need to have checks in place. We need to have clear and transparent mechanisms to ensure reciprocity, and then safeguarding mechanisms. It's unfortunate that the colleagues have left. But President von der Leyen promised that €1 billion would be used to compensate farmers for Mercosur-related losses. That is scandalous. We do not want to be receiving €1 billion once our market is lost, once we have lost our competitive edge. That's not what we want at all. We want to avoid this type of solution or scenario. I'll use a farming metaphor. We can't close the door once the horses have bolted and then compensate the farmers. We need to avoid that scenario from the outset. And then the fourth point, we've heard about this from Agata Galinska, who spoke about the impact assessment. We would like to see this extended, both ex ante and ex post, to all agreements, to not only look into reciprocity, but also to look into the impact of social and environmental sustainability. And our colleague Marin Romano also mentioned the impact on various member states that should be assessed. And we think that this needs to be done, and I'm in a good place to ask for this. We need a multifaceted approach. It's not just one institution that needs to be dealing with this. We're all involved. We're all stakeholders. And we need to improve our protectionist policies. We need to promote our products given the other markets that we are competing with us. But the promotion budget has been completely raised to the ground, and we've heard talk of further cuts as well. And these ideas of transparency, of equal rules or equality in rules, are the same in other regions of the world. And the Commission colleague, I'm sure, will talk. I'm trying very hard to sum up here. I'm sorry, I'll be brief. I realize that you're waiting for me to finish. For us, the important thing is reciprocity based on rules and based on political choices. And the choices that we're seeing at the moment are about the CAP. And I'll end off on this issue. We've heard promises, but what we're seeing in the MFF is an absolute threat to the farmers. They will not be able to sustain the blow. It's impossible to build bridges if you don't first lay the foundations. Thank you.
Bueno, muchísimas gracias por esta intervención.
Thank you very much indeed for that very passionate and complete call to arms. Social sustainability is, of course, very important. That's one of the points that Ariana just mentioned. Without further ado, I'll give the floor to Vibeke Warnek, who's the Political Secretary in the Food, Drink and Tobacco sector in EFAT. As a trade unionist myself, I'm very eager to hear what you have to say. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for the introduction and for the invitation. Effectively, EFAT being the European Trade Union Federation for Food, Agriculture and Tourism, I will of course give the perspective of the workers in these sectors, and I think we have not so much yet talked about them today. The issues we deal with today is trade, reciprocity, and sustainability. If I take these terms, I would think that the aim should be sustainability, a sustainable food system, and that trade, as we have heard, is of course one angle of the system. And it could be a driver for sustainability. It could be a driver to raise labor standards and for a strong, sustainable, and fair economies that actually can benefit the workers and the societies on both sides of the agreements. And reciprocity as a tool, ensuring actually we apply the same standards, ensuring a level playing field, we have talked about it, and fair competition. So the idea is products that do not meet European environmental, social, and safety standards should not be allowed on the EU market. But which are actually those standards which we wish to ensure? For which aims do we wish to use trade? I think that is the question I would like to discuss. So what is actually a sustainable food system from our perspective? Well, if I take the perspective of effort and the workers in these sectors, of course, we would say a sustainable food system is about quality jobs. It is about advanced health and safety standards. We need strong collective bargaining rights. We need competitive wages. But it is as well about tackling the long-standing systemic issues we have in our markets. So it is about concentration. It is about shareholder value maximization. It is about short-termism and speculation in our markets, and we really need to tackle these issues. But it is as well about coming to direct employment and equal treatment. And that is why you might have seen it. EFAT came out with a model directive on subcontracting and labor intermediaries just last week. And it is about CAP. We have heard it. And from our perspective, it is about social conditionality of CAP. For us, that is a key pillar, and we need major improvements here still. But it is as well about environmental standards. It is about the Green Deal and the Farm to Fork, and the ambition has been of very short duration here. So if all this is about the bigger picture, about fair distribution of wealth, trade is one part of this sustainable food system. We have heard it. We should speak then about policy coherence. So it should be aligned with the social objective. It should be a fight against climate change, and it should not be a race to the bottom through unfair competition. We have heard a lot by the Commissioner about the ILO standards. So fundamental ILO conventions should be respected, should be mandatory. The vision does not mention it. And in our trade agreements, very often, it is not mandatory. There are no effective sanctions and strong monitoring systems. If we speak about, and we already did, about Mercosur, is that an agreement we think lives up to reciprocity as we want it, to improving standards? Well, from our perspective, certainly not. The TSD chapter is too weak. As I said, we don't have the enforcement mechanisms. We have a lot of incidences of core labor rights violations, unfortunately, still in the Mercosur region. You can see that, for example, in the ITUC report. We have endangering of health of the workers and the environment in Mercosur through toxic pesticides. And this might re-enter then eventually Europe. But we have a new issue as well, which is the rebalancing mechanism. And I want to end up with really the call to say reciprocity of trade should not mean that Europe lowers its standards. It is about a level playing field, maintaining high standards in Europe and incentivizing our trade partners to change practices. It is not about importing products produced cheaper and circumventing what we do not accept here. If we speak about chemicals, child and forced labor, violation of trade union rights and deforestation. And reciprocity can never mean that in the EU we deregulate. And that is what we are doing for the time being. We deregulate in the name of competitiveness. If this is on cap, we need to keep the social conditionality. We need to reject any exemption currently discussed. Public funds can never reward those who violate workers' rights. But it is as well about deregulation of reporting obligations. And again, it has been mentioned by the Commission. It is about the 3D, about the CSRD and the omnibus package. Deregulation at its best and seriously undermining the recently adopted legislation. So we think the Commission has to withdraw that and the EP to oppose. High social and environmental standards as well as collective bargaining are not an obstacle to EU's competitiveness, but its main engine, and it should help to improve standards as well globally. So deregulation is not sustainable, and this is not the reciprocity trade should achieve. Thank you very much.
Muchísimas gracias.
Thank you very much, Wibke, for that statement. Thank you very much for your contribution. Thank you very much for really shining a light on human rights, decent work, as well as the dangers that can arise from dismantling these structures within the EU. Let's move on now to the next speaker. Our next panelist is Virginia Ensley. She is the International and Institutional Relations Manager at the Fair Trade Advocacy Office. So welcome, and you have about 7 to 8 minutes for your presentation. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, Vicepresident.
Thank you very much, Vice President.
In English, because I don't know how to say all these things in Spanish. Hi, everyone. Thanks for the invitation. I'm Virginia Ensley from the Fair Trade Advocacy Office, and I hope that you can see that I will be speaking the same angle. I am pushing also for social sustainability, but I am taking the approach of smallholder farmers in the EU, but mostly outside of the EU. So the Fair Trade Advocacy Office and the Global Fair Trade Movement, we speak on behalf of smallholder farmers and agricultural workers in least developed and developing countries. So the premise here, and I have just a few slides to make it a bit more visual, but don't worry. The premise here is that yes to raising sustainability standards, EU standards, and applying them to partner countries and to third country actors, but the issue being that EU standards are often very stringent, requiring significant investment in infrastructure, technology, training, and in maintaining this also in the long term, which for many small-scale farmers means an overwhelming extra financial burden, which means that the already thin profit margins that they have, maybe sometimes not even any profit, because some of them cannot even cover the cost of sustainable production, that those margins shrink even more, and this just to comply with EU standards. So I guess that you can see how this may not sit very well and may not be very fair if it's just to raise EU sustainability standards. So the premise that we have been working under is, okay, let's look at the other measures that could be there. And this is something that was mentioned by DG Trade. Let's explore what could be done at multilateral level first, maybe. We have been discussing, and we developed a paper that is the core of the slides that you are seeing, where we had a lot of conversations with third country actors, and we said, like, okay, this is the issue. Let's look at deforestation regulation. Let's look at organic regulation. Let's look at the corporate sustainability due diligence. What do you think about that? And everybody agreed in saying, we believe in the Green Deal. We believe in raising sustainability standards, but the issue is how you do it. The way that it has been done, for example, with EUDR, does not work for third country actors, does not work for the countries themselves at government level either. And they have been saying, if we address this issue, maybe at multilateral level, that's better. There, we as third countries, as third actors, we feel that we have a voice. If it's just unilateral measures, we feel our voices are not heard. And it's us who need to implement. So if we don't have a saying in how this is built, then we are against the wall with the hands tied. So what we are saying is, like, let's explore first if multilateral approaches could be a venue. But I understand, it was mentioned also by different panelists today, it can be lengthy, the fora may not be there, so okay, maybe we go to the next level. Let's explore bilateral. Ariana, you were mentioning mirror clauses. Yes, that could be also a possibility. Maybe instead of going first to unilateral measures, let's explore if we can do it bilaterally. That allows also third countries to have more of a saying in how this is done, instead of EU priorities being pushed onto them. But also, there may be cons in using bilateral approaches. So of course we can go to unilateral approaches. But in there, what we are saying is, let's look at the design. The problems here have been not in the objectives of the different regulations, but in the design. If we were to focus on a positive agenda that includes dialogue, other flanking measures to support the unilateral measures, and a toolkit for these different measures, then we wouldn't have that much conflict, so to say, for when we look, for example, at the implementation of the EUDR. And when it comes to the unilateral measures, the toolkit that we're talking about is just to make it inclusive, co-designed, and co-implemented. And we're thinking of, non-exhaustively, 6 elements that should be incorporated. The first one should be an assessment of best options among unilateral tools. It's not only about deciding for a directive or a regulation, it's deciding also about other measures that could be out there. The role of voluntary sustainability standards, the role of labeling that was mentioned already, what could be done with sustainability eligibility criteria, mandatory due diligence requirements. There is a lot in the toolkit that could be that should be assessed there first. A second element is the need to have binding ex ante and ex post sustainability impact assessment. This was not done in the EUDR, and now the compliance gap is huge. If this would have been analyzed beforehand, something would have been done in the design that would not lead us to the problems that we're facing today. A policy coherence for development lens would be appreciated. Taking again the example of the EUDR, they do have an impact in developing countries. So we are talking about developing objectives in policies that should be analyzed. A fourth element is the co-design of these policy interventions. A case-by-case approach would be better than a one-size-fits-all approach. And another example that may resonate a bit more with you is in the organic regulation. The previous regulation worked under an equivalence approach. That was better. That sit better with other countries. That fit better the reality in the ground. Made it easier to comply with EU standards because it led a space to adapt it to what is happening in the ground. But the new regulation is full compliance, which is showing in the case, for those that are familiar with the regulation, there is a core requirement of group of operators, the number of members that should be in the cooperative, which is of 2,000, which makes sense in the European context. But yesterday we were in this same room in the Living Income and Living Wage Conference with partners from Ghana. One of them is the president of the biggest cooperative in the world that has 100,000 members. Do you imagine the problem that they have now because they need to separate their cooperative from 100,000 members to individual entities of 2,000? You can imagine the cost and the burden that that's entailed, and it's only because it was established under an EU parameter that did not take into account the reality in the other countries. The fifth element is co-implementation. There should be reasonable transition periods. 2 years may sound like a lot of time, but look at EUDR. We have everybody, even partners at EU level, asking for more transition period because it's not being enough. And the sixth element, and with this I wrap up, is incentives. Currently, the market does not sufficiently promote or reward sustainable production to economically justify the increased production requirements. And we're seeing this in the organic regulation, where the cost of the organic label, the EU organic label, has raised from like average 50 to 200% more costly. And what farmers are saying is like, I will need to invest a lot of money, but I'm not even selling all my organic production as organic because the market is not big enough. So if we are raising the standards, okay, we want more stringent control in the organic production, but the market is not big enough, then we're pushing the farmers at a loss. And I don't think that that was the objective of the EU organic regulation, to follow that example. And then the role of consumers should also be looked at and linked to this. We need to work in improving consumers' choices and awareness over sustainability. Thank you.
Sí, muchísimas.
Thank you very much, Virginia. Thank you very much for highlighting the voice of third countries, dialogue with them, and this political coherence that we need to have when it comes to development policies beyond our borders as well. We're now going to move on to Leonard Mitri from DG INPA. He's going to talk about food systems transformation and the EU's global partnerships. So thank you for being here today, and 7 to 8 minutes for you as well for your presentation.
Thank you very much, and good morning from another Commission service. I understand both Flavio and Agata from Trade and Agri were there, and they are colleagues with whom we work closely. And I just need to say that Virginia, it's like she's a DG INPA colleague. We bring you with us. Look, from a DG INPA point of view, clearly we deal a lot with trade and trade irritants. We are a bit of the part of the house of the Commission services where we try to clean up the mess, or some mess, from a policy coherence point of view. Now, this might not be the core of what Arianna and what Wipke mentioned, because the debate there is very EU-centric. And let's be clear, there is a lot of EU-centricism these days, because even division is pretty much EU-centric. If you look at a complete analysis of what is EU and non-EU, you see that 95% is a target audience of EU. How can we calm down farmers? How can we calm down the private sector operators? But I just need to say, and we have been in contact with Arianna in the past, like the world today is very much different from that, not of 10 years ago, of 6 months ago. And that needs to be a reality check of what we discuss in terms of trade, reciprocity. We are in a totally different ball game of trade tensions, tariff escalation, trade wars. Across the road today, there is the EU-AU ministerial. Probably no one knows about this. It's not hitting the headlines. But the European Union needs to build bridges where the bridges have been totally annihilated, blasted, completely shattered. And I don't need to tell you, post-COVID, the war of aggression in the past 5 to 7 years has created already a lot of creaks in the global food systems, let alone today when you have a US administration which has created cuts in ODA, 83% cuts. The US administration was a key ally and a key player. So music to my ears when you speak about G7, G20. But there's no G7, G20 anymore. Like, there's not even a low common denominator anymore. Before, and I was on the front line in G7 when Italy was presidency, you had the same common denominator. Today, you don't have a common denominator. If you speak about SDGs, you will have the US saying, SDGs, no. Gender equality, no. Rights-based, no. So we go to Rome, because that's where my remit is, it's the Rome-based agencies. You are blocked practically all the time on the basics. So good luck in terms of reciprocity, and good luck in terms of multilateralism. Now, we need to be realistic of what we want to achieve in a multilateral context, because it will be a world of bilateralism, whether we like it or not. Now, as a Commission official, we will always say we support multilateralism, we support fair and order-based, but we need also to be realistic between what I call the spin and the reality. And bilateralism is here to stay or be accentuated. Why? Because you see what happened in the US. The moment that Trump triggered tariff wars and escalation, there was a flurry of activity across the globe. Red carpet treatment, India, and this was speed, fast. Now, we don't know the precise ramifications. You know how much time we take to negotiate a trade agreement. This is not a question of days and weeks. It takes years. So it all depends, first of all, and that is, I think, what the SDO, the observer, needs to assess. How do we reconcile the EU dynamic? And the EU dynamic is a reality, which is basically, I attended the Vision conference in the Square a few days ago, and clearly the trust is money, MFF. Now, that is a question that has to be handled. You need to have funding to be in transformative approach, and it's nice. It's nice to be reciprocal and sustainability, but also we are in, and I didn't hear much in the interventions, a bit from Arianna in terms of call directly, it's EU strategic interests. So what's in it for us to be strategic from a food security point of view? To still be a big external player, but also to be a friend of the global south. And that no one mentioned except Virginia. Because if you want friends, and sometimes we speak about who are our friends today, who are Europe's friends? I think we need to do a bit of a soul-searching exercise. Who are our friends? Who are our neighbors? And how do you build bridges? And I think there needs to be a bit of a discourse, a bit of a stocktake, which we do as DG INPA, but across the services. I did 10 years of agri, so I don't like to speak about trade and agri and Sante. I speak collegially here. I think we need to do a bit of an assessment about what has been achieved from a regulatory point of view in the outgoing Commission, and what is unfolding in the new Commission. And the unfolding outgoing Commission, we know that there was heavy regulation. Now, I deal with the EUDR fallout. You know how many questions we receive on the EUDR, which probably for you is en passant not an important file anymore for an EU audience, but I can tell you, I have probably to deal with 20 to 30 requests every week from the likes of Brazil, Vietnam, to Burundi, to Ethiopia, and Ethiopia has 5 million coffee producers. 5 million. So I think that puts into perspective. And then, again, no one mentioned what we call cumulative effect of regulation, meaning that you have organic regulation over MRLs, over EUDR, over high levels of standard setting in a country like Rwanda. We're not speaking only about Brazil's here or Vietnam's, okay? That is the concern of the EU audience. But how do you bridge the gap with Africa? And that is what the EU Ministerial is going to discuss. And that is why we go also on the 27th of June to Rome with Commissioner Hansen to try to build bridges on trade, on research, on accompanying measures. But let's be also honest. We can't do compensating accompanying measures on all the regulatory process through a trade facilitation. We can give free trade access, everything but arms, or like we have with Angola, what are known as the Sustainability Investment Facilitation Agreement. But these are not fully what I call compensation, and it's not the role of the EU just to do compensating mechanisms, because we don't have the funding. I just give you an idea. On EUDR, we have a portfolio of 100 million. Someone once told me, Leonard, that's peanuts. But the question is, do we have more than peanuts these days? I don't think we have more than peanuts. Because we don't have the funding to do compensating measures to build up those bridges across a globe, which, as you know, we are in heavy conflict from the UN Security Council, with a situation in Russia which is becoming more and more acute. Hopefully there will be a solution one day, but in the Middle East and in the rest of the Sahel and the Horn of Africa, we need to build those bridges because we can speak as much as we want about trade and sustainability. The big political reality of today is the risk of migration flows and how I can create those millions of jobs in Africa to stem the migration flows that risk escalating the more you create additional burdens for our African partners to trade with us. So the question is, do we want gold plating, silver plating, sugar coating, and how to compensate if you want to build those bridges? And I think that is something that we need to discuss as Economic and Social Committee in a challenging way to try to reconcile internal interests with external interests in view also of an MFF which will be extremely, extremely politically sensitive because we know where the direction of funding is going to be, and the business as usual of the past is not going to be a reflection of the future in terms of size, in terms of focus areas, in terms of prioritization. So we as INTPA, what we are trying to do is to create those bridges, to create accompanying measures, to create sustainability also of our partner countries, but also we need to be realistic that the Brazils and the South Africas of this world are different from LDCs and small island developing countries, which make a big bulk of the developing world. So ready to continue the discussion with you, ready to engage into specifics, but here we enter into very specifics. The EUDR plus CSDDD and the organic regulation, I have a number of operators from the South coming to us to actually respond to what Virginia said in terms of the reality of Ghana or reality of Dominican Republic on bananas compared to the complaints that European farmers have. We're totally different. For those who are in football like me, it's like playing in a super league compared to a third division. We're not comparing like with like when we speak about complaints at EU. Clearly, this is an EU institution, focus is EU, but let's be also sensitive of whatever we do has implications, especially in a geopolitical context.
Pues muchas gracias.
Thank you very much to the European Commission. A number of open issues when it comes to policy, budget, external relations. You, of course, set the scene going through these very rapid changes where all of us are really wondering about the role of multilateralism, and there are also other rights like equality that are being called into question, not just and wondering where we stand, not just in Europe but across the world. So if the President allows me, we have 10 minutes to have a Q&A. So our speakers have raised some very important issues, and so we could close today's session with some amount of discussion. So who would like to ask a question? Puchu? We have Giuseppe at the moment, so Mr. Pentinen as well. So let's start with Giuseppe. I'll be quick. Thank you very much to all the speakers. Especially thank you to Leonard for this call back to reality. I think it's good that at the Schumann Roundabout in the morning we have people who issue a bit of a wake-up call, you know, where people, the veil is dropped and we take stock, we accept that the world has changed. I would really love for this reality to be communicated to the EESS and the Council, because sometimes reading the news, I just can't see the EU that I know within it. If the EU wants to continue to remain a leader in the domain of ideas and multilateralism, I think we have to be much more proactive. Otherwise, we're just going to be left on the sidelines and the world will be moving at a different speed in a different direction. So what we need to do is work in our domain to ensure that things continue to work and they continue to work the way we want them to. For example, closing ourselves off to a market like the US, I mean, I think the only way to do it, to remain in that market, is to be more aggressive. We can't just sit around waiting for the Trump administration's mandate to end. No, I think this is the moment to act. We've got to be proactive. And as the EU, we have to move at a different clip. So we can't just sit around and move so slowly. So thank you very much to Leonard for bringing us back to reality. I thank you very much for that perspective.
Gracias, Giuseppe.
Thank you, Giuseppe.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for your excellent presentation. I have two remarks, I would call them remarks or examples. The EU is currently negotiating with India, and there's a goal to have an agreement later on during this year. When we take a look at India, we have a lot of problems with sustainability, working conditions, reciprocity, whatever is that. This morning or today, the European Parliament, the Legal Affairs Committee, adopted a report on rule of law in the EU member states. And they messaged that our rule of law situation is alarming. We are in peril. We have a lot of problems. So it means the EU has problems, India has problems, and we try to find a kind of compromise between those. There's nothing like perfect world, no more. At least Mr. Leonard Mitzi explained that very well. Second short example is the Mercosur agreement and the climate actions. Mr. André Millet, the president of Argentina, has been trying to find ways to get rid of the Paris Agreement. But there's an obstacle. And what is that obstacle? If he just says goodbye to the Paris Climate Agreement, it is a condition for Mercosur Agreement. It means that if he's going to leave, Argentina will leave Paris Agreement, there's no more Mercosur Agreement. There will be severe economic losses. And so this is example number two, that we are not living in a perfect world, that we have to try to find our ways, and new ways. Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much. Any other questions in the room? Iroska.
Thank you very much. Grazie mille. Scusate se questa volta mi permetto di parlare in...
Apologies, I'm going to be speaking Italian this time round. But thank you for giving me the floor. I don't have any specific questions. I just wanted to make a comment, really, and to thank you for having organized this panel discussion, because I think President Reale really has invited the most important spokespeople to take the floor on this particular topic. To come back to reciprocity more specifically, I remember when we worked on an exploratory opinion requested by the Hungarian presidency on agri-food systems. President Reale really wanted reciprocity to be mentioned in that opinion. And not just reciprocity, but all the topics that we've been hearing from you about this morning. Thank you very much, by the way, for your contributions. And all of that became very clear in the opinion, and this is why I've decided to speak Italian today. As Arianna was saying right in the beginning of the panel discussion, farmers are a multifaceted stakeholder. I think those were the words used. And it's this aspect of being versatile or multifaceted that really is represented by the Economic and Social Committee. It's about dialogue, which is fundamentally important. I hope in future that there will be specific dialogue so that all of these opinions, these points that you have mentioned can actually come to fruition. Thank you very much for your input, and thank you to all who have spoken.
And Stoyan, I think, would be the last, and then the Costa as well. Please keep it as brief as possible, and very specific questions and comments, so we can then conclude the panel. Stoyan, please.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much for the floor. Thank you very much to all the speakers. It was really a great debate. And thank you to Arianna, especially because you're like a speaking farmer's voice, very loud. But I have a specific question. Thank you very much for your presentation, Mr. Mitzi. I have a specific questions because obviously there is like a wave of populism on the global scale. And everybody is like betting more and more. We heard about, of course, we know what happens in the US. We heard about Argentina, etc., etc. So do you think our response needs to be just to raise the bets? Because obviously, all right, we have some issues in terms of reciprocity, but those countries that we are trading with, they need to sell. And Europe, it's a big market. So do you think it's the response needs to be to lower our standards or to just to keep firm? Because otherwise, all right, they're risking to lose their markets, and what they're going to do? They can't sell to all of them to the same place. And especially when, to a certain degree, US is going into the direction of protectionism, that means that the possibilities to sell over there is going to be also lower for them. So what is their choice? Because you're speaking about, not to be Eurocentric, EU-centric, and to have also the other point of view. But again, for a trade, for a deal, we need both sides. Thank you.
Bien, y muy rápido.
Great. And very quickly, Mark.
Madame Virginia en a parlé. Je crois qu'au niveau...
Well, yes, Ms. Virginia mentioned this as well. I think when it comes to food, we need to produce locally and eat locally. And even at the level of a country, I mean, France imports half of the chicken that it eats. Where are we going? There are so many standards that are imposed. Farmers at some point will take a step back and say, whatever, just import from wherever you like. It's cheaper, it's easier, it saves us the work. Thank you.
Merci ces questions.
Thank you very much. Thank you for all of those questions. And I'll take it in reverse order this time, given that we have a few extra minutes that the President has graciously given us. Please try and be very to the point so we can move on to the third part of today's meeting. We've got 5 minutes for 4 people. Bear that in mind.
So to the point on lowering standards. I'm not saying lowering standards. I'm saying that whatever implication of a political decision we take has external implications which are not always factored. the reality on EUDR is that there could be trade diversion effect towards the strongest players in the global value chain. It's a fact. Then if we want to play geopolitical, we need also to be realistic of who are our geopolitical allies and who are going to be disengaged from our geopolitics, because I go to conferences and I am the only one bashed about regulatory issues. It's not the Americans, it's not the Chinese, it's not the Gulf states, it's not anyone else. It's EU bashing all the time. Now, I don't have a problem, I stick to the line, but clearly there has to be a bit of a soul-searching exercise on the calibration of ambition in a geopolitical context which is totally different today than last year. And you know that the Commission Work Programme of 2025 is somewhat nuanced, recalibrated compared to the outgoing. So I would say never lowering standards, but any standard setting should, first of all, look into the external dynamics and the geopolitical implications. You can't just do a regulation and then we say, let's see afterwards. That might be too late.
Muchas gracias por el rigor en la.
Thank you very much for that brief reply and sticking to your speaking time. Now, Virginia, you have the floor.
Thank you. Well, I think that most of the things have been said. I don't want to take more time because we're going over time. I do have copies of our paper if you're interested a bit more into seeing how we're looking at the issue. And perhaps to make it even clearer, we had yesterday the conference that I mentioned, and we had the farmers from Ghana, the cocoa farmers, saying, we support EUDR. We see firsthand what happens if we deforest. So trust us, we know what the effect is. We support this, but it's about the design. So Leonard was just mentioning, like, okay, how do we deal with the after effect? What we are proposing is a way to how to fix all of this if you work better at the beginning, at the co-design. So that's what I want you to keep in mind, that as a fair trade movement, we do support raising EU standards, even if it does have implications in third partners. But let's look at how we do it, and let's be inclusive, let's look at co-design, and let's look at co-implementation. Thanks.
Yes, thank you. I think for me, after this discussion, the question would really be on what basis do we want to compete? And deregulation actually would neither help our colleagues globally in the other countries, because it does not improve their working and living conditions neither. And just to make the example of the Mercosur agreement, it was of course not only the European trade unions going against, but as well our colleagues in the Mercosur countries. Thank you.
Molto rapidamente sul tema delle.
Just very briefly on the issue of short chains, eating locally, producing locally. Well, from a farmer's point of view, that is a challenge. It's about finding complementary agri-food systems, and it's something that we are very interested in. We'd love to have short chains where the food gets to the consumers very quickly, and at the same time we would like long chains that are fair as well, where the value is distributed. So it's a very complex issue that we need to work on. And then drawing inspiration from Leonard, with whom I've discussed on many occasions, multilateralism is an important topic. It is currently in crisis, at least a political multilateralism. If you look at the UN, G7, G20, G77, even less. But there is a type of multilateralism that I would like to ask you all to think about, and that is a multilateralism based on civil society stakeholders. What I was trying to say in the beginning of my input is that Calderetti is a founding member of the World Organization of Farmers. It's farmers across the world that talk about all of these topics. They talk about more topics than our governments deal with. And it would be easier to arrive at agreements in the interest of large groups in our society, of communities. You know, our farmers, for example, represent a huge part of the population where we want to build bridges. So where political multilateralism is in crisis, perhaps we can find more action on the civil society side of things. Thank you.
Pues muchísimas gracias.
Thank you very much. I'd like to thank the panelists on behalf of the SDO and the EESC, and to end with a bit of a positive message. Of course, this call to activism, to advocacy within civil society is very important. It's a multifaceted sector that is very committed, and there is still a lot that they can say and feed in when it comes to shaping this sector. Thank you very much. And now I'll hand over to the President, who will continue with the meeting. Thank you very much.